All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, introducing Mike Benz. He runs the Foundation for Freedom Online, and that is foundationforfreedomonline.com. And he is an anti-censorship crusader, but used to be an employee of the State Department, which is how he knows so much about censorship, interestingly. And you might have seen his incredible interview with Tucker Carlson last week. Welcome to the show, Mike. How are you doing?
Doing great, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate you joining us on the show here today. So I've seen, bits and pieces of the stuff that you're doing on Twitter over the time, and I meant to have you on, but then you just laid it all out for Tucker Carlson last week in a way that is just really crystallized so much of, what I already knew, what we've learned from the Twitter files and all of that kind of thing. But just you put it together in one solid narrative for us. I thought it was really interesting the way that you started off by saying that in order to talk about censorship online, we first got to talk about free speech online. That was always a CIA plot too, or a national security state plot too, is how you started the thing. So I guess, but one thing that he didn't ask you that I'd like to ask you to start was if you could talk a little bit about your jobs at the State Department and what it was that you did, how long you were there, and your role in that end of the regime change machine that has obviously given you such insight into how it works now, fighting against it from our side.
Yeah, Scott, and so thanks for that. And actually, before answering that about the State Department, just a funny note. I'm glad that you picked up on that sort of deliberate chronology of that Tucker segment of starting out with the national security state's role in free speech before it turned to censorship, because my foundation for Freedom Online, I agonized for a long time about putting the word freedom in the name of a civil society institution focused on internet issues, because all of the major NGOs or institutes or foundations that have the word freedom in their title are now explicit censorship advocates. They were all there's this coterie of probably 20 to 30 different NGOs that have the word freedom in their title, that were all set up in the 1990s and funded by the State Department and the Pentagon in the 1990s, that were all about free speech, and so that's why freedom is in their name. But then after the sort of events between 2014 and 2016, from the Ukraine situation into the Trump election, they all switched to this censorship model. So I actually was hesitant to name my Foundation for Freedom Online, because I didn't want to be mistaken for being a censorship organization with the word freedom in the name. I mean, this is just how bad things have gotten in that respect.
It's funny. I'm writing a book right now about the new Cold War with Russia, and I've been studying a lot about the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, and a big part of that was run by a Soros front group called the Liberty Institute, which is almost the exact same name as my institute, the Libertarian Institute. And it's just funny that I'm sitting here writing about all of this stuff, and they're essentially pretending to be for what I'm for, which is liberty.
Right, but it's purely tactical, just for the purpose of prying open a country, overthrowing its government, and then essentially looting it. I mean, it's like it has nothing to do with the actual principles of freedom itself. I mean, freedom is the last thing they want. This is why they, in Ukraine, for example, there wasn't an election after the coup in 2014. Yatsenyuk was installed. It's a managed blobocracy, not democracy, but they need the patina of that. to have you have this sort of international recognition that's necessary under the new rules of war. But to go back to the State Department, so I was there in 2020 when basically at the desk that sat at the center of big tech and big government. It was in the Economic Bureau, which is essentially our soft power projection on economic issues abroad. And the internet is a massive vehicle for that. The economic interests of our so-called U.S. national champions. These are companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter at the time, but also Microsoft and Apple. All of the big tech companies have larger markets on the global stage than they do on the home front. That is, there's 8 billion customers around the world versus only about 300 million here in the U.S. And in order to maintain captured markets, and in order in some cases to maintain markets at all, it requires pressure from the State Department on foreign countries in order to make sure that business conditions are operating in a way that's favorable to U.S. national champions. And this is something that has been, uncontroversial essentially in American statecraft for, coming up on 2.5 centuries. I mean, we were doing this in Latin America in the 1800s under the Monroe Doctrine. We were doing this, in Europe under the Marshall Plan doctrine. We were doing this all throughout the Cold War under our sort of, empire building under the democracy predicate. But this is the idea has always been that if the State Department does favors for big business, well, big business is essentially the American middle class. This is how you have pensions. This is how you can afford a home. This is how you have this sort of the middle class miracle of the American economic prosperity of the 20th century. I think the problem is by sometime around by the mid to late 90s, the disconnect between globalism and national interests, global multinational corporations and their financial class, and the sort of trickle down philosophy. It's interesting because a lot of conservatives, who embrace Reaganism, sort of poo-poo liberals who don't accept trickle-down economics. And there's a funny situation sort of happening right now where the shoe is a bit on the other foot, where those same conservatives are now being told, and they don't like it, I should add, that they should basically go along with globalism because there's a trickle-down effect on the U.S. economy, but they're not seeing that. And in fact, the incentives are now so far misaligned that there's good reason they're not seeing that. You could make the argument that, that in the 20th century, when all of our manufacturing was still in the heartland of this country, that when the State Department threatened country XYZ in order to do what's best for the steel companies there, the steel companies were still employing U.S. labor. So in theory, the government was doing favors for big business, but those big businesses were employing the Americans who voted for that government. There was, as morally dubious as you can argue these inherent aspects of statecraft are, there was at least you could argue it was for the benefit of the citizens of the homeland. Now it's essentially all the spoils just go to the managers of the American empire, our foreign policy establishment, and that trickle down is gone. People can't afford houses, people can't afford college, people can't afford medical insurance. It's and there's not even it's not even a plan to course correct. Our money is the biggest thing we're spending the money on in the midst of this economic collapse on a relative scale to places like China is on foreign wars for that purely and exclusively benefit the donor and drafter class of the foreign policy establishment.
Yeah. So now in the let's go back because on the free speech part, because obviously the censorship part is very important, but you talk about how from the very beginning of the internet, really in the early 90s, that the national security state saw it, that free speech, whatever double-edged sword was going to swing back at them in terms of American dissent, was tolerable if they could use the internet to help undermine foreign governments that they wanted to overthrow. And so you have them, messing around in Slovakia, in Croatia, and then Serbia, and then the more famous color revolutions of the W. Bush years in Georgia and Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan and so forth, and then later the Arab Spring. So, essentially these are, not all of them are quote unquote color coded, but they're all pretty much the same thing, right? Where the U.S. and these NGOs, NED and IRI and NDI and all those Soros groups and whatever, they use free speech to circumvent the oppressive structures of some of these governments that they want to overthrow, and use liberty in a narrow sense to their advantage there to get what they want and do their regime change. So I think the way you were explaining it to Tucker was, you didn't say this part, but it sounded like what you're saying was, they were willing to tolerate free speech by Americans as long as they could use the internet to help them accomplish coup after coup after coup overseas. But then what happened was it started blowing back on them, and social media stopped being so reliable at helping accomplish State Department ends, and that's when they kind of panicked and decided to clamp down on us like this. So can you talk about, I guess, the first part of that first and then the second?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Were they willing to tolerate free speech by Americans? Because, it's been my contention that if Pat Buchanan had won the presidential election in 1992 on the basis of a, massive popularity of, from blogs and forums after the World Wide Web was rolled out in 1991, that we never would have had a free and open internet to begin with. That is, if a sort of populist, and I'm not even, endorsing all of, Buchanan's, ideas or sort of grand sort of theory of the world, but he was a populist challenge in a sort of proto-Trump way to the, to the sort of George H.W. Bush and Clinton sort of axis that echoed the very same Jeb Bush, Hillary Clinton, flank that Trump defeated from his right and left in 2016. But I do believe that if this had happened earlier in time, during Web 1.0, but social media didn't come out until 2004 with Facebook, and then 2005 with YouTube, 2006 Twitter, 2007 the smartphone, which put it all on steroids and whatnot. But for the first 13 years of the internet, it was all blogs and forums, and there was not the speed and scale that social media on centralized platforms allowed. I don't think that the foreign policy establishment anticipated a domestic threat from the internet really at all in the beginning. There was a lot of open questions for the first 7-8 years of the internet, whether it would even take off at home. If you remember, Paul Krugman had a famous quote where I think this was in 1998 or something, where he said, I mean, it was in the late 1990s, I believe, where he said, in the end, I think it'll show that the internet had no more, no greater impact on American society or commerce than the fax machine. I mean, this was, and then there was the big .com boom at the end of bust at the end of the 1990s, where a lot of people thought, okay, now the internet's really dead. There were a lot of fits and starts with respect to the domestic internet, but the whole time it was being piped into countries around the world to circumvent state control over media in countries that we were looking to either destabilize to bring to the negotiating table or outright regime change. There's a great book on this by Yasha Levine called Surveillance Valley, which sort of goes country by country through this. Now he doesn't apply the same analytical lens, which I thought was, which was something, that was, he sort of put all the stars in place with respect to that free speech story in the book, but he never actually sort of connected to them to say, with some of the other, I think information that maybe if, he had a different background might have seen quite easily. But for anyone who's looking for a factual citation for the role of the national security state in the free speech, diplomatic and intelligence infrastructure that we're talking about here, I would recommend that book. If this analytical lens is helpful to read it with, you'll see what I'm talking about immediately.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, and we know, like, from the examples from the early color revolutions in the Clinton era, that the internet, as primitive as it was then, was very useful. For example, getting around censorship in Serbia, and that, they had to do radio from Hungary, right? And then, but the internet, they could run from all over Belgrade, and they could essentially just circumvent the old airwave-based media and go around it and plot really overthrow, overthrow the government there. Did you ever see, I bet this is still on there somewhere, The Onion had a thing years ago where it was like a fake Sunday morning news show where they're all sitting around talking about how the CIA has this really cool new invention called Facebook. And what it does is we fooled all the people of America and the world, these idiots, into all mapping their own networks of who all knows and is friends and does business with each other. And they're doing all of our work for us, and we'll completely pwn them and control all of their lives forever now and whatever. You ever see that one?
I have not, but I'm adding that to my queue because
it's a good one.
Funny.
Yeah,
there's a lot of people who do talk about, this connection, this sort of strange, perhaps coincidental, you've probably heard of this LifeLog, sort of DoD project that supposedly sort of closed up right before Facebook. I don't know enough about that to be able to weigh into it. It's always been on my sort of to-do list. I'm also writing a book as well. And, this is one of these sort of open research issues around that. But the fact is, I did mention in that Tucker interview, the sort of strange origin story of Google growing out of the DARPA grant at Stanford, that joint CIA-NSA program that DARPA was funding that gave money to Larry Page and Sergey Brin while they were at Stanford 1 year before they started Google. And that project was, basically taking search engine aggregated results to map how so-called birds of a feather flock together online. So that they could do that mapping of political groups with around the world with how they were searching for things on the internet.
Hey guys, I've had a lot of great webmasters over the years, but the team at expanddesigns.com have by far been the most competent and reliable. Harley Abbott and his team have made great sites for the show and the Institute, and they keep them running well, suggesting and making improvements all along. Make a deal with expanddesigns.com for your new business or news site. They will take care of you. Use the promo code SCOTT and save $500. That's expanddesigns.com. Man, I wish I was in school so I could drop out and sign up for Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom instead. Tom has done such a great job on putting together a classical curriculum for everyone from junior high schoolers on up through the postgraduate level. And it's all very reasonably priced. Just make sure you click through from the link in the right margin at scotthorton.org. Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Real history, real economics, real education.
Hey, y'all, I got a new coffee sponsor, Mundo's Artisan Coffee at mundosartisancoffee.com. When I wake up in the morning, I feel like my brain is all dried out. I need to pour a hot mug of rich, tasty coffee all over it to get it back working again, like 10W30 for the noggin. Though not necessary, it helps if the coffee tastes good. Well, Mundo's Artisan Coffee does taste good. They get the best beans from all around the world, and they don't burn them. Support the show and support your brain at mundosartisancoffee.com. Just click the link in the right margin at scotthorton.org. Now, so you mentioned 2014 as the year of Ukraine's loss of Crimea after the coup there, but something else that was very important in 2014 was Israel's massive bombing campaign in the Gaza Strip. I believe that one was cast lead. And that was the first one, I know from Twitter, and at the time we covered this and remarked upon it. That was the first time the American people ever sided with the Palestinians. And that was because the stranglehold lock of the old legacy airwave media over, and even cable TV news media, was broken. And people could just look on Facebook and on Twitter with their own eyes and see what the people of the Gaza Strip were going through while the Israelis cry victim. And they're just killing, at that time, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And I don't remember exactly what the numbers were, but it was certainly the first time that the American people sided with the Palestinians in the thing. And I remember saying at the time, oh boy, they're going to flip out over this at the State Department because, as you're talking about, this was a State Department tool. It was their tool to use. And now here it was blowing up in their face. Too much free speech. The same thing happened with the cop thing, too. I know there was a lot of kind of top-down effort around that, but it also was the case that Facebook, and I guess this is before a lot of algorithm tweaks. We're talking about going back 10, 15 years. You know, I had people who were not political people, or just regular people that I know in the world, would say to me, what is up with the cops killing people these days, man? And what it was every time the cops killed somebody, Facebook made it a national news story, whereas before it was just local news. Well, a cop shot a guy. They always do that. But when it's a national news story, every local police shooting is a national news story. And it's just day in, day out. Oh, my God, look at this guy running away. And they put two in his back. And then it's just they keep coming. They really radicalize a lot of people. And then, again, I think the Gaza War 2014 cast lead, it really got through to the government that, this is backfiring now. And now it's time to rein this thing in.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot there. I mean, Israel, obviously has, a very close connection with the State Department and, both the U.S. and the sort of UK Foreign Office. But there has been a pretty big split that's grown between the Israeli government and much of NATO that really actually started right after 2014, with the passage of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which is more of an Iran energy deal than it was a nuclear deal. There was a very significant falling out between, I think much of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, and in particular the Netanyahu government, in Israel. Israel has, its own sort of censorship, ecosystem architecture. They don't come into their society with a presupposition of free speech. They have a formal censorship office. They don't have a First Amendment. It's not even really an aspirational goal. And there's not the same level of censorship coordination between the U.S. and Israel. What Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs might do with respect to internet speech. And Naftali Bennett, actually, interestingly enough, was actually the architect of a lot of the censorship technology. He spearheaded. He gave presentations in 2016, 2017 on all of the new sort of speech detection techniques that were being developed by the Israeli military. To my knowledge, those were not adopted in the U.S. I know that there was parallel efforts, very, very extensive parallel efforts here in the U.S. and across NATO. But starting in 2015, there became this really proxy war that we're still living through between much of NATO and the Netanyahu government in Israel. This is not to say that the two are at war with each other, but there's a conflict now, a conflict of interests on economic grounds, a conflict of interests on security grounds, with respect to Iran and Qatar and the sort of and Saudi Arabia. There's this Iran. The Iran deal, I think, in 2015 really set off an era of discord between NATO financial and energy stakeholders and the Israeli government that has almost, I'm trying to think of a comparable analogy since, or anecdote since 1948, where there's been this much tension for this long. But I raise that to say that, my focus is primarily on the NATO side because there is actually now a fair amount of daylight between the interests of NATO and the Israeli government that is causing friction in a way that was not really there before. And so in terms of coordination of censorship of speech on the internet that impacts Americans, I don't know that the Israeli government. Now there was pressure that the Israeli government, I believe, is putting on Facebook with respect to. You can argue that that's happened with Musk to some extent, but more coming through the ADL. When when it comes to formal governments, what NATO is doing right now is so sweeping. I mean, this EU Digital Services Act is absolutely existential to the soul of the Western world. And I didn't, Israel doesn't really have a hand in that. That's coming straight from the EU, which is coming straight from NATO. And that takes what was already the European censorship mindset, where hate speech is effectively illegal in essentially every NATO member state except the U.S. I mean, a criminal offense to speak a hate speech. But that is now being that base of not having a First Amendment, a Jenga tower, is now being constructed over top of it for so-called disinformation. So under this new EU Digital Services Act, the NATO censorship law that just passed last year, and its rules are currently being codified as we speak over the next several months. It'll come into effect sometime before the 2024 election. Being a social media platform and hosting disinformation, per NATO's definition, is going to mean you're not going to be able to operate in the EU. And the EU has a larger market than the US. There's 500 million people in the EU. It's existential to the operation of any tech platform on planet Earth to be able to operate in Europe. Under these new rules, NATO will define, it gets to define disinformation. And if you host disinformation, you're booted out of the entire European market unless you pay a penalty that's equivalent to 6% of global annual revenue, which, to my understanding, is essentially higher than the entire, profit margin of most tech companies. So this basically makes, NATO the king arbiter of all speech on the internet, unless the State Department pushes back on them. And the bind we're in right now is that the State Department is not going to push back on them. The State Department pushed this.
And you're saying under this law, they'll be able to say, hey, we don't like Scott Horton and Mike Benz being on Twitter, and you got to kick them off because everything they say is disinformation. And as long as you allow them on Twitter, you're banned from the EU. And Musk will have no choice. It'll be American edgelords versus the entire European market.
Yes. And now those rules are the specifics of the rules are being codified. This is like a standard, a bill gets passed and now something is law, but now there's the regulatory interpretations and the specifics of it. But what the EU, the NATO censorship law says is that you cannot operate in Europe unless you obey the disinformation compliance requirements. Now, what constitutes disinformation? The network of NGOs who are designated to be the trusted flaggers and the arbiters, the specific remedial steps you might, take, the safe harbor provisions, all of that is currently being developed, but the law is already passed. All they need to do is just finalize the regs. There's nothing more to vote on. It is law. They just need to, put the specifics of it, which is just, which is just basically committee meetings. And I should add, who's helping doing those laws? The EU has formally engaged NewsGuard to help write those rules.
I know them. They extort me all the time.
You know who's on the board of NewsGuard?
Tell us.
Well, let's see. The former head of the CIA, NSA, 4-star general, DHS, State Department, the former head of NATO. So you have General Michael V. Hayden, who was the head of the Central Intelligence Agency.
He was the guy who was the boss of the NSA on September 11th, 2001, and was never held accountable for his criminal negligent homicide of 3,000 Americans that day in any way whatsoever, was only promoted after that. Sorry, continue, please.
Yes, and also on that note, there's a great documentary about his time at the NSA called The Good American, about Bill Binney, the NSA whistleblower. Uh-huh. Towards the end of that movie, there's an incredible reveal about Michael B. Hayden's role in the NSA's construction of the domestic bulk surveillance collection to map the lives of all everyday Americans, for counterintelligence purposes, but essentially to create this vast domestic spy apparatus that became essentially, the subject of so much scandal during the Snowden era so many years later, had its origin in Michael B. Hayden's stewardship of the NSA. But
Yeah.
Michael B. Hayden was the head of the CIA, the head of the NSA, and a four-star general.
Mhm.
Who else is on the board of NewsGuard? Well, you've got Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who is the head of NATO from 2009 to 2014. That is for the Obama term into the Crimea annexation. The entire global head of NATO is on the board of NewsGuard. Then you have Rick Stengel. Rick Stengel described himself as Obama's, quote, propagandist in chief. He was the undersecretary for public affairs at the State Department and the founder of the State Department's first ever censorship office called the Global Engagement Center, which was set up initially to censor ISIS groups, to help the social media companies censor ISIS groups on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, but then transitioned to for domestic purposes to help censor the 2020 election and to help censor COVID-19. They did this foreign to domestic switcheroo. And Rick Stengel, is is a guy who was formerly the managing editor of Time magazine, who described himself as a free speech absolutist. And then when Trump won the 2016 election and he was kicked out of the State Department, he wrote a whole book and also an op-ed you can look up in the Washington Post calling for an end to the First Amendment, because the First Amendment, free speech on the internet, is what allowed Trump to be elected. So he went from being a free speech absolutist to calling for an end to the First Amendment because of social media letting people vote for the wrong person, letting people, popularize a person who the blob doesn't want elected. And then you also have Tom Ridge on the board of NewsGuard, who, was the first secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. So again,
I still have my duct tape and plastic sheeting. No, go ahead, sir.
But again, so the EU is, its rules are effectively being written by these censorship gargoyle blob monsters, like the head of the CIA, the head of the NSA, four-star general, head of NATO, head of DHS, and the head of the State Department.
Well, listen, I'm afraid, Mike, you and I are a little bit too eye to eye on this, so I already know what you're talking about, but the audience might not know. NewsGuard are the self-appointed arbiters of who's a disinformationist or not, and they go around essentially extorting every news website into jumping through their hoops in order to get a green happy face. And if you don't get a green happy face, Google is going to downrank your website. Everybody's going to downrank your website. It's going to hit your social credit score big time. And this is something that has, like, for example, Reason Magazine gloats that they have a perfect score, while Gray Zone told them, go to hell. And I told him, you got nothing on me, man. So, I got like a C+ at the Libertarian Institute, and I think antiwar.com as well, because, I want to tell them to just go to hell. But then again, I also want people to ever click on my website again, and they do have that power over me. What can I say, Mike?
Yeah, they do. They set this up on purpose. My foundation has done a ton on this. And if you just literally, so everybody in the audience, if you want to sort of find me and all my stuff on this, just go to my Twitter handle on X at Mike Benz Cyber, and then type in my handle at Mike Benz Cyber and the word NewsGuard, and it will open up an entire cinematic universe of everything about NewsGuard.
Great.
There's probably done 50 videos on it, dozens of reports. It's a massive story. I mean, they are the top gargoyle in the censorship industry on a sort of damage basis. And it's actually, Scott, what you're saying about the Google downranking is bad enough on its own, but it's so much worse than that too. They explicitly set themselves up for the purpose. And on my foundation's website, we've got the clips of them in 2017 talking about how the purpose of what they were doing was to bankrupt alternative news by killing their so-called programmatic ad revenue. NewsGuard is a formal partnership with the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum has a subgroup called GARM, the Global Agency for Responsible Media. That is the that is the pool of international, all of the blue chip multinational groups, their advertising pool of money that goes towards so-called programmatic ads. This is the way almost all websites were monetized eyeballs, on the internet. This is what allowed the modern news model, business model of online news. There's about $2.6 billion in programmatic ad revenue that passes through GARM, and NewsGuard has killed all $2.6 billion of that through this filter that they've had GARM install that says if you don't have a certain NewsGuard rating, you get kicked out of the ad exchanges for programmatic ads. So you can't monetize your website unless you have a one-to-one, peer to, you can no longer have passive income through ads if you don't have that's what you need to do, sort of manual partnerships. You need to, like a common thing that's happening now on the right is, people are going to like, a sort of Mike Lindell type person and having a one-on-one, having a one-to-one, formal advertising contract, because no vaguely heterodox or anti-war institution can qualify for any pass-through money through passive ad exchanges, the automated ad process, because NewsGuard has killed them all.
Man, it sounds like it's illegal, I guess, but nobody has standing to sue. The Supreme Court's never going to stop them. This is at the core of the empire, right?
There's definitely a lot of potential plaintiffs with standing. The question is it's got to be done right, and you're going to be up against, you're not suing NewsGuard when you sue NewsGuard. NewsGuard is Stephen Brill and Gordon Krovitz. They hold themselves out as two mainstream media journalists who just wanted to fix the problem of fake news. So that's the front they hold out. You don't see NATO behind them. You don't see the CIA, the NSA.
I'm sorry, shame on Brill especially. That guy used to publish a magazine that had investigative reporting in it and stuff like that. What a bastard. Well, not that he was the best or anything, but he was a real journalist before.
Scott, didn't you do a debate with Bill Kristol?
I did. Am I
remembering that correctly?
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
So there's a great interview that Bill Kristol did with Gordon Krovitz when they were setting up NewsGuard. And Krovitz is basically pitching Bill Kristol on this brilliant new idea they have. And Bill Kristol, I don't want to say to his credit, because that's like a sentence I almost never want to come out of my mouth. But he had a funny instinctual observation that even Bill Kristol, sort of observed in real time as this monstrosity apparatus was being set up. He said, well, gee, Gordon, isn't this just establishment people saying that they like establishment news? And that line basically, it's a lot darker than that, right? Because it's not, again, NewsGuard is not just establishment journalists. It's the CIA and the NSA and the Pentagon and NATO and the State Department and DHS, as well as this whole coterie of State Department funded NGO representatives and donor and drafter class folks.
Well, and as we've seen too, completely cloaked in secrecy, right? Like this, if it wasn't for Musk turning over all those files to Matt Taibbi and his friends, and if it wasn't for those lawsuits by those southern governors, we would know much less about this combine. They had this whole kind of spider web of NGOs and groups all essentially tracing back to the Pentagon here that was completely unreported a year and a half ago, right?
Well, a lot of it was available open source. So I've been working on this for 8 years. I started writing Weapons of Mass Deletion and making a movie about it in August 2016. The thing is these people actually do need to brag about what they do publicly in order to outcompete each other for government funding. And so, I'm very strange that way. I basically sacrificed, almost most of my, adult life at this point, basically lurking in these people's Zoom calls and knowing them better than I know most of my own friends. So, I don't think it actually required a lot of these recent reveals, to know about this, but, being able to actually get public awareness because of that, it's what's been useful about this is those receipts being validated in such formal channels make it much easier for people to accept a common set of facts of what they're up against. And, one other thing I should just add real quick before we move on from the NewsGuard point is, one thing that I found, for example, in 2019 is while DHS was setting up its internal censorship office that ended up censoring 22 million pro-Trump tweets for the 2020 election in a scandal that, has been broken open now for some time, and there've been multiple hearings about and lawsuits about. But they had an actual document in the Department of Homeland Security in 2019 where they called for a whole of society. This is the federal government writing about a plan to get the private sector, the civil society, and partnered media institutions to support NewsGuard in 2019. This is DHS.
Mm-hmm.
This is a government plan to prop up a non-governmental, but CIA stacked censorship organization to do the dirty work that DHS would not be able to do itself.
Yeah. Well, and that goes back to, I guess there was the argument you'd have heard from even some so-called libertarians missing the point on this. They're like, oh, these are private companies. They can do what they want. But no, this is entirely a government program from beginning to end here. And these private companies, so-called, are just subcontractors for the Pentagon, the FBI, DHS, et cetera, at this point, correct?
And NewsGuard's a great example of that. NewsGuard got a $750,000 grant from the Pentagon. They also got some State Department funding. But yeah, so this is like saying, listen, in the 1980s, when the CIA was, basically running crack into Miami to fund the Nicaraguan Contras.
Hey, Ricky Ross is a private company, man.
We're saying that the shrimping company that they were using, as a front to put on speedboats to run into the Miami ports, that shrimping company is just a private company selling shrimp. It's like, what are you talking about?
Right.
They're literally a pass-through for the CIA, for the intelligence organizations. And by the way, I should add this. If you get money from the State Department, you are now you're now a state company. Okay, that them should be the rules. If you're libertarian minded, you should really sort of adopt that mindset that if you are getting if you want to not be a government company, if you want to be a private sector company, then you can't have a formal partnership with the government.
Yeah,
you can't have funding from the government. If you want us to think of you as a private company, you need to be truly and veritably private.
Yeah.
If you are public-private, you are now, guess what? You're now public. That's like saying, I'm an Italian restaurant with a formal partnership with the local branch of the Sicilian mafia. Am I an Italian restaurant anymore, or am I a mob shop? The moment you get in business with the government that way, you are no longer a strictly private entity. And unfortunately, for reasons that I think have somewhat to do with the fact that that we require this level of doublespeak, and we require this level of sort of strategic stupidity in order to get away with laundering all this. But then partly, I think just the American people have not adapted to the speed of these new developments in time to build a new vocabulary and a new sort of mental constellation of how their own world works, to sort of nuance those distinctions around private sector and public sector entities.
Yeah. Well, so what always helps me is to think of the chronology of the thing and how it evolves over time. So I think one of the narratives that's been really important that you talked about is how this is, typical. Speaking of libertarianism, it's a government program that just keeps growing and finding new excuses for itself. So first, Bush, empowered the Shiites through Iraq War II, and then everybody decided that was a big mistake. So then they had to do the redirection, which included backing al-Qaeda in Iraq in Syria for 2 years, until the Iraqi-dominated faction broke off and conquered eastern Syria. Instead of focusing on Assad, they focused on eastern Syria and called themselves the Islamic State. And then a year later, they rolled into western Iraq and conquered all of that, which Bush had left, open, stateless territory, and wide open for such a thing. So then, in a way that the Mujahideen never succeeded in this way during Iraq War II, and I guess it was social media was the difference. That in Iraq War III, ISIS was able to make themselves a really big deal online and recruit, I don't know how many thousands of Europeans and Americans and, of course, Chechens and whoever else, Uyghurs and Afghans and everybody else to come and fight with them there. So then the Democrats said, oops, not that they would ever admit their responsibility, but they built the Islamic State caliphate for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi with their billions of American tax dollars in conspiracy with the Israelis, the Turks, the Saudis, the Qataris, etc. And so then they said, now we have to implement this massive censorship regime in order to try to prevent ISIS from recruiting online through YouTube, through Twitter, through Facebook, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, as I think you talked about in the Tucker Carlson interview, that once Iraq War III was over and that had mostly faded out, and then Trump got elected instead of Hillary Clinton, we had all of these, job holders needed work. So they just made Donald Trump the next ISIS. And they just all went and got jobs at Twitter and at Facebook, and I guess FBI agents by the dozens. Just went and they framed him up for treason with Russia. And then they adopted this whole censorship regime in order to enforce that narrative, to unperson all the Russiagate dissenters off of the internet. That was what really got antiwar.com downranked and all that was when they did the completely ridiculous, and we know it was Michael Weiss from the Daily Beast and the Atlantic Council, who was the front, the guy behind Prop or Not, accusing everyone who was good on Russia of being a Russian agent and demanding that Google take us off the damn internet. Mike?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Well, there's a couple of funny things there. I think starting from the front of what you said, there's kind of a no small irony on ISIS's role on the internet. Are you familiar with the $500 million that the Pentagon paid the London PR firm Bell Pottinger to produce ISIS propaganda videos on the internet? It's kind of amazing. You can Google this. It was widely reported in the Guardian and the Independent and all over. There was a little over $500 million that the Pentagon paid to produce ISIS propaganda videos. Now they said we did this because every video came with essentially an IP address tracker, so we could determine who was watching ISIS propaganda videos that we produced. So it's basically a sort of spy device is how they build it. Mm-hmm. That was $500 million producing Hollywood-style ISIS propaganda from our own Pentagon. But that's exactly right. And the common banner, I mean, this is something that was very, very, very shocking to me in 2017, 2018, when I was watching this all unfold in real time. And I was, in these people's disinformation conferences and just thinking to myself, what the hell are so many counterinsurgency people doing here? There were so many veterans of exactly what you were just saying, the Iraq, Afghanistan counterinsurgency people.
Yeah, the Coindinistas, they called themselves when they were championing tripling the Afghan war, which they lost anyway.
Right. Well, they took that special set of skills of grousing and managing, foreign populations under a military occupation to the United States of America. They took that back home and they parked themselves at the Department of Homeland Security to say, well, this is what we did to shape the information environment when we were dealing with an insurgent threat like ISIS. There's all this domestic extremism happening here. There are these threats to democracy that are happening here. Then that just meant the populist right. This is years before they even had, the sort of January 6th type, hysteria to try to hang this on. It was the same people. It was these empire managers whose special set of skills is literally subjugating people who were upset that we were militarily occupying them and stealing all of their resources and installing their government and owning their entire courts and legal systems and education systems.
We're all Pashtuns now, Mike.
We are. And that's just why I say, it's all they're treating Boston like it's Baghdad. It's just there's no distinction anymore.
Well, listen, man. Here's a good one for your file. On National Public Radio, shortly after January the 6th, they interviewed Robert Grenier, he's the author of 88 Days to Kandahar. He had been the CIA station chief in Islamabad at the dawn of the terror war, and kind of inadvertently showed how they helped let bin Laden escape. But anyway, Grenier was interviewed on NPR, and it's this great little double entendre of cool stuff going on, because what he does is he explains, outright admits, that's right, we let Osama bin Laden go. We decided, forget Al-Qaeda, we don't want to get the guys what hit us and killed our people. We want to go after the sort of milieu of extremism in which they were thriving, which meant regime change in Kabul, while bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, moonwalk across the border unhindered and unchased by Delta Force, who wanted only to kill them. And Grenier explains this is the analogy now. He outright admits their treason in helping bin Laden get away. But then he says, that's smart. And that's what we're going to do now. See, the January 6th rioters, the insurrectionists, they're Al-Qaeda in this scenario. And what we want to do is not so much focus on them as we want to focus on, that sort of broader milieu of extremism in which they're thriving, by which he meant the American right, the entire American right, the pro-Donald Trump MAGA movement. Are the Taliban, and we're going to regime change their ass because of what Al-Qaeda did at the Capitol that day, he said.
Yeah, I'm looking at this right now, actually. In New York Times opinion, how to defeat America's homegrown insurgency. And let me just add to this, actually, just because, I'm one of these sort of weird guys who spent way too much time in DARPA grant, looking through all the DARPA grants for this type of stuff with how they actually make the sausage for censorship. I am willing to bet a bagel that Robert Grenier did not come up with this sort of hypothesis about how to manage the homegrown insurgency by doing it targeting the middle rather than leaders or whatnot on his own. That is what you just said is strikingly similar to the DARPA funded domestic censorship grants that were given out to 60 some universities between 2016 and 2020. There's one that immediately comes to mind called Slaying the Online Hate Hydra, which basically posited that if you were against open borders, you were effectively engaging in sort of identitarian hate speech, and they were using the same sort of proxy in Europe for groups that all happened to be peace with Russia parties or anti-war parties, because they tended to be working class and wanted cheap energy from improved Russian economic ties. And so, of course, the CIA and the State Department were plotting to kill all those or politically subjugate all those political parties, and they often would use these hate speech predicates to do it. And what was really fascinating about, for example, just this one thing, just as a reference for the audience if they want to look this up, Slaying the Online Hate Hydra. This is a DARPA funded censorship research grant, which examined 4 different ways to go about ideally censoring the internet in order to take out basically people who had the wrong thinking opinions when it comes to things like immigration. And the first way, was like the classic top-down type thing. Like, you kicked down, this is back in 2018, I think is when this grant was. This is like 3 years before Trump was actually kicked off Twitter. They said, well, we could kick these people, we could kick, the leaders off of the social media companies. But the problem is, there's often this kind of martyr effect. And it sort of feeds into the same issue we have with insurgency, where, we kill one, high-profile person, but that act of martyrdom creates 100 new insurgents because they're all mad that their leader has been taken down. So they said, okay, well, what if we don't do top-down censorship, and what if we topographically map the network of connections that the leaders have to their, say, lieutenant class? Who are the top 20 lieutenants who are not as high profile, who are not household names, who tend to be the key amplifiers of the leader, so that when the leader sort of tweets something out or makes a YouTube video or a Facebook post, it doesn't have that same level of virality because they had their top sort of second in command type, the sort of lieutenant class amplifiers are gone. That's one way we could do it that would minimize the martyr effect. Another way is we could keep the leaders, and we could keep a lot of the lieutenants, but we could do a sort of we could topographically map the whole network, and we could just sort of slowly or randomly or partially ban or throttle or suppress the sort of great unwashed middle who so that way everybody still nobody notices that censorship is happening because the highest profile people still have their accounts, and so do the sort of semi-celebrity people who amplify them, but they're just not. It just looks like they're organically not having any traction, not having any amplification, because the people who don't have a voice to defend themselves are the ones who are getting kicked off the internet.
These people are evil, man. How do they?
This is funded
These are
by the
Americans?
Pentagon. Yes.
Well, okay, so let's talk about.
And you should, by the way, Scott, you should see. I have all this, by the way, on my Twitter page. I've gone over this. Yeah. At Mike Benz Cyber, and just I think if you type in either DARPA or slaying the online hate hydra, you'll see this. The mathematical equations that they actually sketch out to do this are a true sight to behold. I mean, it's almost like it looks. Now I'm not a sort of math quant guy, but the level of computer science engineering that they propose to go into creating this vast system to do exactly what you were just saying Robert Renier was proposing, but for internet censorship in 2018, mind you. I mean, it was a level of technical technical precision that is is truly shocking, and shows that the depths that they'll go to actually execute this.
Oh, they can't keep Rosie, the porn spam bot, off of my page, though. She replies to every single thing that I post on Twitter.
Hey,
no matter
Scott,
what.
you know what? If Rosie starts talking bad about Ukraine war funding, I guarantee you Rosie will be taken care of immediately.
Yeah, exactly. Do me a favor, young lady. Hey, you guys, did you know that I don't just write books, I publish them? Well, the Institute does, and I'm the director, so yeah. 13 of them now, including my 4. We published 5 more in 2023. Lori Calhoun and Tom Wood's books about the COVID regime, Joe Solis Mullen on the fake China threat, Jim Bovard's latest, Last Rights, and our managing editor, Keith Knight's Domestic Imperialism. And we've got more great titles coming in 2024. Check them out at libertarianinstitute.org/books and help support our anti-government efforts at libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And thank you.
Hey, y'all, Scott here. Let me tell you about Roberts & Roberts Brokerage, Inc. Who knew? Artificial bank credit expansion leads to price inflation and terribly distorted markets. If you've got any savings left at all, you need to protect them. You need to put some, at least, into precious metals. Well, Roberts & Roberts can set you up with the best deals on silver, gold, platinum, and palladium. And they've been doing this since 1977. Hey, if you just need some sound advice about sound money, they're there for you too. Call Tim Fry and the guys at 800-874-9760. That's 800-874-9760. Or check them out at rrbi.co. That's rrbi.co. You'll be glad you did.
Okay, so listen, so this goes to, and we're almost out of time here, but this goes to something that you guys were talking about. I used to just joke about this. Democracy is when the Democrats win. Otherwise, they'll frame you for treason and, all of this stuff. But then the thing is that's really right. That's what you're talking about with Tucker Carlson the other day, is they got a whole new damn definition of democracy, which is they get to keep their jobs. And the American empire, especially most of what you described as democracy, means American hegemony in Europe, especially, and then the rest of the world if they can swing it, and has nothing to do, and in fact is the polar opposite of the will of the people at all. And now, it's funny because democracy is always their excuse for intervening wherever they want, but democracy always just means the American national security state gets their way, and it essentially is just no different here in the United States either. And even, look, if you go back 8 years, and I want you to talk about the future this year, this campaign with Trump and everything too, if you can, but you go back 8 years where here's a major party candidate for president of the United States, and they framed him for treason. They had no shame. This is like one hair to the left or to the right, however you would frame it, of shooting the guy in the face in Dallas. It's absolutely as outrageous as it could possibly be, no matter what you think of Trump. I'd have gone to bat for Bernie Sanders or even Hillary Clinton the same way if the secret police framed her for treason. And then, of course, the censorship regime to enforce it. But these guys are way out of line here. And Of course, Biden has only empowered them and has made it clear he wants the Justice Department to rid him of this meddlesome opponent before it even comes to an election in the fall anyway. So I guess if you could just talk about a little how completely feverish it's gotten up there in D.C., where they think that they can do that to a major party candidate and then even sitting president of the United States, and then what you think they're going to do to him now, other than all the trials they have him going on.
Yeah, well, with those trials, I mean, there is a slow motion Dealey Plaza bullet, moving straight at Donald Trump. He's facing 700 years in prison. That's,
can you imagine?
That's an assassination.
Well, an Illinois judge just decided to throw him off the ballot yesterday.
Right.
I says,
Right.
Joe Kennedy, eat your heart out, man. You think ballot box stuffing in 1960 was something? That's nothing.
Yeah. You don't need to stuff the ballots if your opponent can't put in, can't put his name in the ballot. It's that stuffs it, de facto. In fact, she even said that the write-in votes wouldn't count, would have to be quote suppressed. But we are in a place that the country has never been in before. We are in completely uncharted territory in that respect. I made a few videos on my X account about 6 months ago about this, which is that in a way, an assassination. We've had several presidents assassinated at this point. What, three? We've never had a president indicted, let alone convicted or even kicked off. We've never had the system take. You can make an argument when Lincoln got assassinated or when JFK got assassinated, that there's sort of a diplomatic framing of it where you can say, well, damn, a rogue actor took this person out and it was highly destabilizing for a short period of time, but our institutions came in and it didn't really fundamentally change, the American, system of governance. We've got, but even if it was fundamentally forces within that government who were responsible for orchestrating that assassination, you could argue on paper that the system didn't do it. This is the first time that the system in 250 years that the system is doing it and saying this is what we do now as a system. We swallow the people who challenge us, and make no mistake, Trump is winning, has been winning. According to all polling at this point for the past 2 months in all 7 battleground states, he's right now on. If the election were held today, according to the RCP polling average, which aggregates every poll left and right across the country, he'd win the Electoral College by something like 90 points. He is way ahead, and he is facing an assassination if the Justice Department is not stopped. If Joe Biden's Justice Department, while you have on record, according to our paper of record, the New York Times, who published that Joe Biden was putting direct pressure on Merrick Garland to prosecute Donald Trump months before Merrick Garland did it. So, that's Merrick Garland's boss in the White House. And of course, I know that, Scott, you've probably covered Merrick Garland's, seasoned history from the 1990s in his role in various other.
I know that he told the judge, objection, don't let that guy talk about John Doe number 2 anymore. I don't care how many times the witnesses say they saw McVeigh's best friend with him. We're not going to have that in this courtroom, Your Honor. I know he's guilty of that.
Right. Yep, exactly. Him and Eric Holder were both, it's amazing that the all-star team from that both went on to be attorney generals, but perhaps, topic for another day. But basically, you have this situation right now where the American empire has never been as, you can argue that there is a political fragmentalization that's occurring right now at a time when America is losing a great power competition to BRICS countries, that I think is forcing America, in the eyes of the blob, into a kind of formal military rule. One of the reasons you can argue that we've had a First Amendment for so long is because our geographic, privileged position on the world map, combined with the industrial sort of, miracle of the 1800s, and the special economic advantages that the U.S. had, as well as in our transatlantic partnerships with London, sort of allowed us the luxury of a largely free speech society. Free speech is kind of the first casualty of war, because the things that undermine consensus for the war are deemed to be, without that whole society consensus, you fall apart very quickly. It can also be exploited, yada yada. Now this is what they argue to basically indict everybody under the sun. But the point that I'm driving at is, I can't see through the fog of war for 2024. There's too many wild cards. I was one of those people who bet very heavily on the 2016 election for Trump, even when polls were saying that he was, a 3-1, 4-1 underdog. It was very, very obvious to me, just from just a lay line of sight that there was this huge online presence that was going to convert in a way that was totally undercounted, by the traditional polling. I was not able to see through the fog of war for 2020 and did not make any predictions about this. I can't, there's so many wild cards about 2024, and there's so many crisis events that may happen between now and then. What's happening right now with the Ukraine funding is in some sense as existential to the fate of sort of parapolitics in this country as the presidential election. If, let's just say, Mike Johnson as House Speaker rejects all funding, I don't think this is going to happen, but let's just say he rejects all funding, in this new Ukraine spend because Biden refuses to budge on border security or whatnot. I made a video about this yesterday on Twitter that's got, I don't know, almost 1 million views right now, which basically made the argument that, I would not put it past, they might burn the Republican Party to the ground if the MAGA wing sort of wins. Mitch McConnell just yesterday announced he was stepping down. Mitch McConnell is the blob's sidearm, but in the same way that he's a part of the mafia, the thing that the mafia offers you is protection from other mafias. And I don't know if Mitch McConnell is sort of aware that has been made apprised of what may befall a truly populist Republican Congress House. I think that if House Republicans hold the line on that, they're gonna rushigate Mike Johnson, and they might rushigate Jim Jordan and everybody else. I mean, they indicted all of Trump's lawyers. They indicted Trump himself. Rudy Giuliani, Jeff Clark. The whole gamut. I think that the new rushigate for 2024 is probably gonna be the mother of them all.
Yeah, man. And you know what? Sorry, just to go back one step that I left out of my whole rant about the government program expanding thing was how the wars, especially Iraq War III, but all of the Middle East wars had led to the giant refugee crisis in Europe, which had led to the rise of the populist right in Europe, to Brexit and the election of a lot of populist writers to the European Parliament. And then that was a huge part of this censorship regime kicking in over there, too, where, remember, they pretended to believe that Russia was behind Brexit and was behind all of the votes for the right-wingers for the European Parliament in France and Germany, which both of those intelligence agencies later said was actually not true at all, of course. But that was the big narrative, was that the only reason that people are objecting to thousands and thousands of Afghans and Syrians moving to their town all at once was because Putin made them do it.
Yeah, it's actually amazing that you say that, because there's a whole unpublished story, which is something that sort of forms part of the guts of the book that I've been writing for so long. But Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former head of NATO from 2009 to 2014, who is now on the board of NewsGuard, actually, organized this thing called the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity, which is one of basically this formal NATO election censorship cabal to censor EU parliamentary elections, which actually partnered with Joe Biden in 2018 before Joe Biden while he was basically retired, before he decided to run for president and after he had been in the VP slot. So there's a formal partnership between Joe Biden and Anders Fogh Rasmussen. But they held this conference, and Anders Fogh Rasmussen, was reflecting on the populist threat, and he acknowledged that that the rise of the populist right in Europe was because of this migrant crisis, in the after the Gaddafi assassination and and this rush of refugees into Europe and the threat that posed to their identity, leading them towards populist politics, and those populist nationalist politics going up against the sort of globalist institution set of NATO. And it was very interesting. This is a speech from 2018 where he sort of goes through the strategic analysis from NATO's perspective of how to handle this, including the possibility of maybe sort of giving them of containing them through counterinsurgency tactics, but maybe also placating them a little bit by either reframing or scaling back after 2016. Some of the open borders into Europe. From that, so it's a very interesting, sort of deeply nuanced speech at a time when NATO was very much in crisis. Because at that point, the French election had not yet been decided. They thought if Marine Le Pen won, that Frexit might happen, and Spexit might happen with the Vox Party in Spain, and Italexit in Italy, and Grexit in Germany. I mean, they were freaked out at the time, and were strategizing about how to stop the rise of the populist right, the same way that with Operation Gladio and the various CIA and UK Foreign Office efforts to stop this. So the communist left. For the same reasons, played out all across NATO countries in the 20th century. So they've gone from turning the blob's Department of Dirty Tricks against fascism in the run to World War II to turning it against global communism in the 20th century, and now it's against domestic populism. Its Department of Dirty Tricks have been fully turned inwards against us, the people they're supposed to serve.
Yeah. I know Obama don't give a damn, but he's probably paying some attention. But the real funny part to me is how W. Bush doesn't even care, right? All these years later, he's just sitting in his bathtub painting his toes, completely oblivious to the world that he made as the first leader of the world empire in the third millennium. It's just unbelievable. In a way, it's the perfect kind of irony from a storybook or something, that like, this is the guy who set us down this path.
Yeah, although, but again, I totally agree with that. Obama is actually not a passive player in this. It was Obama who did an hour-long speech and then a 5-hour panel at the Stanford University's Internet Observatory, the Stanford Internet Observatory, which is basically a big CIA State Department cutouts run by Michael McFaul, and has basically a bunch of CIA and State Department people there. But it's and the topic was disinformation is a threat to democracy. Obama basically said free speech on the internet is the number one threat to democracy, and called for this whole society model to censor populist political speech. He's done multiple not just speeches on that, but the Obama Foundation has a ton of people that are getting funding through the Obama Foundation for AI censorship through the AI ethics and responsible media programs there, and the emerging leader programs of people working on that issue space. So, Obama's got a very curious background himself through the community organizing and through, his mother's role at USAID and, various other sort of very interesting aspects of his foreign policy resume. But he's not, I'm not saying that he's any sort of mastermind or architect in this. I don't think that he is, but he is playing essentially a sort of senior elder statesman role in providing this sort of clean, formal, almost shadow State Department type diplomatic PR campaign to support internet censorship. So he's very much being wheeled out for that. And you'll see actually George Bush is from time to time as well. George Bush actually also, did remarks on disinformation as a threat to democracy, and how the fire is coming from inside the house, and it's not just on the foreign side. So, they're wheeling out all the Hall of Famers to all support this PR push to censor the American people.
Well, I think if there's a difference there, it's that nobody gives a damn about W. Bush anymore. But for Barack Obama, his important role there, as you're saying. It's really the psychology of telling other center left liberals and progressives that this is what we're all about. And our great former president that we wish was still here says it's that we're doing the right thing and this kind of thing. Whereas if he was saying, geez, guys, this is America, we don't want to go that far, then it would mean something to them. I don't know. But
right, because puts you at odds. I mean, imagine being in the left coalition, and and then now you're going against Barack Obama if you are for free speech on the internet. That's a hard thing on a number of levels.
Yep. So yeah, that's an very important rubber stamp from him of as a former president of the United States, former liberal democratic president of the United States, saying that this is great, this is right, we should keep doing it, and you guys are doing a great job and should keep working harder, and all the rest of that's hugely important. It's not like he was forced out by scandal like he should have been or anything. You know what I mean? He's not Richard Nixon. They love him. They think he's great, and so they take what he says to heart big time. So anyway, I'm sorry. Exactly. I'm so over time. I could talk to you the rest of the afternoon here. I took so many notes from what I've been reading on your website and the Carlson interview and what you've already been saying today. And we're going to do this again soon. Please don't be a stranger, Mike. This has been great.
Great. Thanks, Scott. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. All right, you guys, that is Mike Benz, B-E-N-Z, that is, and you can find him online on Twitter. He is Mike Benz Cyber, at Mike Benz Cyber on Twitter. And his foundation is called the Foundation for Freedom Online. And that's the website, foundationforfreedomonline.com. The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.